on June 24, 1991, Glenn Nitty Gritty Holness was executed with 3 bullets inside a Brooklyn record store, his blood pooling directly beneath his own vinyl crates. The trigger was pulled by a rival artist, but this physical assassination was merely the final stage of a much darker secret. Nitty Gritty didn't die over a genuine neighborhood dispute. His liquidation was engineered in a Kingston boardroom by executives who discovered that manufacturing a fatal blood feud was the ultimate marketing campaign. The origins of this ruthless strategy trace back to a much darker reality, one carefully hidden behind the music of the previous decade. The Western world embraced the cheerful, sun-drenched reggae melodies broadcasting from the Caribbean in the 1980s. Consumers viewed this music as an escape, a soundtrack for carefree coastal living and global unity. Yet, the physical reality behind these tracks involved predatory producers trapping impoverished youth in hostile Kingston studio compounds. These executives deliberately withheld royalties, forcing vulnerable vocalists into narcotic dependency to survive grueling, unpaid recording sessions. One such asset was a young talent named Nitty Gritty. He provided the lucrative, childlike vocals that enriched foreign distributors while he faced starvation and physical exhaustion in the slums. Why did a system capable of producing such universal joy operate entirely through the ruthless financial cannibalization of its creators? Glenroy Osborne entered the world in 1957. He grew up in the impoverished sectors of Kingston, Jamaica. This environment operated entirely outside the protections of formal urban infrastructure. Economic survival required navigating a localized economy dominated by predatory opportunists. Young men possessed very few assets capable of generating legitimate income. The Jamaican music industry during this era functioned much like a decentralized cartel. No regulatory bodies monitored the working conditions of performers. Musicians had no access to labor unions or legal representation. There were absolutely no trust funds established for underage or vulnerable talent. The men who owned the recording equipment held absolute authority over the local economy. By the early 1980s, the technological landscape of reggae underwent a drastic transformation. Producers discovered the efficiency of computerized drum machines and digital synthesizers. This digital dancehall era eliminated the financial burden of paying live studio bands. Studio owners now required a massive, continuous supply of cheap vocalists to layer over their automated beats. Vocal talent became the primary, expendable raw material of the industry. Nitty Gritty stepped into this volatile industrial machine as a prime commodity. His physical vocal cords produced an unusually high childlike resonance. Studio executives immediately recognized the commercial viability of this distinct acoustic signature. A sweet, innocent voice delivering harsh street narratives created an extremely profitable auditory contrast. Distributors in North America and Europe paid premium rates for this specific sonic contradiction. The valuation of his vocal asset happened rapidly and without his financial input. Scouts operating in the slums directed him toward the major studio compounds. These facilities were heavily guarded structures designed to keep unauthorized personnel out. They were also engineered to keep profitable assets securely inside during recording sessions. Nitty Gritty entered these concrete rooms seeking basic economic stability. He encountered a system of total intellectual property theft. Producers routinely presented illiterate or desperate artists with predatory, handwritten agreements. Nitty Gritty surrendered all publishing rights and mechanical royalties the moment he stepped behind the microphone. The executives claimed ownership of the master tapes in perpetuity. The creator of the sound retained zero legal claim to his own biological output. The financial exploitation extended directly to his daily physical survival. Studio bosses consistently withheld standard flat-rate session fees. They utilized financial starvation as a deliberate management tactic. An artist who possessed cash might refuse a demanding recording schedule. By keeping Nitty Gritty impoverished, the executives guaranteed his daily return to the microphone. Recording shifts frequently stretched beyond 20 consecutive hours. The physical toll on the human body was immense. Vocalists stood in poorly ventilated, smoke-filled rooms without adequate hydration or nutrition. The executives demanded continuous, flawless takes regardless of the performer's physical degradation. Any complaint regarding exhaustion was met with the immediate threat of replacement. There was a seemingly infinite line of desperate youth waiting outside the studio doors. The system treated human vocalists entirely as disposable machinery. Once an artist's voice deepened or broke from fatigue, the producers simply brought in the next candidate. Nitty Gritty understood the precarious nature of his employment. He recognized that his survival depended on maintaining an impossible level of productivity. To extract maximum labor from their assets, studio operators actively facilitated narcotic dependency. They supplied stimulants to vocalists as a standard operational procedure. This was not a recreational luxury offered to the artists. It was a functional chemical tool used to suppress hunger and eliminate sleep. The drugs allowed the producers to keep the recording tape rolling through the night. Some historians suggest this chemical reliance permanently altered the psychological baseline of the workforce. Nitty Gritty absorbed these substances simply to endure the grueling industrial demands. His physical dependency became another chain binding him to the studio complex. The executives controlled both his financial income and his chemical stability. Escaping the compound meant facing acute withdrawal on the hostile streets of Kingston. While Nitty Gritty eroded physically, his international market value surged. Foreign distributors moved thousands of his vinyl records across Western markets. The financial surplus generated by his childlike voice flowed directly into executive bank accounts. He did not receive quarterly statements or bonus checks. He merely received permission to sleep on the studio floor until the next session began. Eventually, consumer tastes in the foreign markets began to shift. Distributors noticed a rising demand for aggressive, confrontational street narratives. The sunny, innocent contrasts that initially sold records were losing their commercial momentum. The studio bosses needed a new product line to maintain their revenue streams. They looked at their existing inventory and decided to reprogram their assets. The executives instructed Nitty Gritty to abandon his previous thematic approach. They dictated a complete overhaul of his public persona. He was ordered to project an image of extreme street-level aggression. The producers supplied him with instrumental tracks designed to sound menacing and abrasive. They demanded lyrics that detailed criminal enterprises and violent territorial disputes. This strategic rebranding was purely a commercial calculation by the ownership class. They did not care how this forced persona would affect Nitty Gritty's reality. By broadcasting violent threats over the radio, the artist inherently invited physical challenges from rival factions. The studio bosses safely insulated themselves behind reinforced compound walls. They sent their vocal asset out into the streets wearing a newly painted target. Nitty Gritty possessed no leverage to refuse this violent new directive. Rejecting the aggressive script meant immediate termination and a return to total starvation. He stepped up to the microphone and recorded the hostile lyrics demanded by his employers. The childlike vocal tone was now weaponized to sell an artificial, corporate-mandated hostility. This commercial pivot fundamentally altered his trajectory within the Kingston ecosystem. The records press during this era documented a disturbing psychological transition. His delivery became more erratic, fueled by the relentless recording schedule, and provided narcotics. The executives packaged this genuine exhaustion and marketed it as authentic street grit. They successfully commodified the real-time deterioration of their own employee. The cash registers in London and New York validated their ruthless operational strategy. Local rivalries began to solidify around these manufactured aggressive personas. The system intentionally blurred the lines between studio entertainment and actual street warfare. Executives realized that public friction between artists generated massive free publicity. They actively encouraged their roster to insult vocalists from competing studio camps. This strategy effectively outsourced corporate competition onto the bodies of the impoverished artists. Nitty Gritty found himself trapped in a highly dangerous commercial paradox. His value to the studio now depended on his willingness to project extreme physical harm. However, projecting severe threats in Kingston carried immediate, real-world consequences. The men who profited from his aggressive posturing offered no physical security detail. He was forced to navigate the increasingly hostile streets entirely alone. Records remain unverified regarding the exact profit margins secured during this specific transition period. However, industry observers noted massive infrastructure expansions among the leading studio properties. The executives purchased luxury vehicles and heavily fortified real estate. Meanwhile, the vocalists generating this wealth struggled to afford basic transportation. The economic disparity within the system reached an absolute undeniable peak. The psychological burden of this forced aggression began to manifest in Nitty Gritty's daily interactions. He grew deeply paranoid about the intentions of his peers and his employers. The chemical coping mechanisms provided by the studio only amplified this hypervigilant state. He understood that the industry viewed him merely as a biological recording device. If he fell victim to the violence he was forced to sing about, the machine would simply replace him. Late in the decade, the producers recognized the need to escalate the tension further. Standard violent lyrics were no longer sufficient to drive the desired sales volume. The market demanded direct, personalized conflict between specific, recognizable figures. The executives drafted a new operational blueprint to monetize direct interpersonal hostility. This mandate required Nitty Gritty to engage in targeted high-stakes audio warfare. This specific vocal assignment represented a critical point of no return. The studio executives essentially drafted a bounty contract, using Nitty Gritty's voice as the currency. Every aggressive syllable he recorded increased the probability of a physical street altercation. The producers meticulously engineered the sound levels to maximize the abrasive, threatening tone. They finalized the mix and immediately sent the master tapes to international pressing plants. Nitty Gritty left the studio compound after this grueling, pivotal recording session. He walked back into a neighborhood that would soon hear his manufactured threats blasting from sound systems. The executives had successfully converted his biological survival instinct into a highly marketable audio product. They locked the studio gates, securing their valuable equipment for the night. The vulnerable human asset was left outside to face the consequences of their corporate strategy. The financial reality of his situation remained utterly stagnant despite his increased workload. The producers refused to adjust his session fees to compensate for the added physical risk. Nitty Gritty bore 100% of the street-level danger. The ownership class retained 100% of the international publishing royalties. This asymmetrical distribution of risk and reward defined the entire Jamaican music economy. Some documents suggest that Nitty Gritty attempted to renegotiate his daily rates during this period. The studio bosses swiftly rejected any requests for basic financial equity. They reminded him of the endless queue of hungry vocalists waiting outside the compound walls. He was explicitly told to maintain the hostile recording schedule or face total economic excommunication. The system utilized the threat of absolute poverty to maintain perfect operational compliance. His psychological state deteriorated rapidly under this relentless corporate pressure. The combination of financial starvation, forced hostility, and chemical dependency created a highly volatile internal environment. The studio operators monitored his decline, but made zero interventions to preserve his health. Their only concern was ensuring he remained upright long enough to complete the required vocal tracks. The machine was running at maximum capacity, entirely fueled by the slow destruction of its workforce. The digital dancehall era proved that human empathy had no place in audio manufacturing. Nitty Gritty was perfectly programmed to execute the violent script designed by his employers. He had traded his natural, childlike vocal talent for a temporary reprieve from starvation. In return, the industry locked him into a trajectory that promised severe physical consequences. The stage was meticulously set for the deliberate commercialization of his impending downfall. The localized economy of Kingston's music scene originally revolved around massive mobile speaker rigs known as sound systems. These towering stacks of wooden bass cabinets served as the only accessible broadcast network for the impoverished urban population. Operators of these systems required exclusive custom-recorded audio tracks to attract paying crowds to their open-air events. These exclusive recordings were pressed onto soft acetate discs called dub plates. The financial viability of a sound system depended entirely on possessing audio material that rival operators could not access. Historically, these outdoor events functioned as communal gatherings, featuring friendly, competitive audio showcases. Selectors would play their exclusive dub plates, and the crowd would determine the superior sound through applause. The vocalists providing these custom recordings earned small flat-rate fees for altering their lyrics to praise specific sound system operators. It was a micro-economy based on localized prestige and neighborhood allegiance. The financial stakes remained relatively low, and the physical risks to the vocalists were negligible. This cooperative economic structure collapsed when international distributors recognized the raw commercial power of the live event recordings. Cassette tapes capturing the chaotic, high-energy atmosphere of Kingston dances began circulating in the underground markets of London and Brooklyn. Foreign consumers exhibited a massive, previously untapped appetite for the unpolished reality of the Jamaican street environment. Distributors realized they did not need to manufacture polished, radio-friendly reggae to generate substantial revenue. They simply needed to package and export the raw friction of the urban soundscapes. The studio executives analyzing these export figures identified a disturbing but highly profitable consumer trend. The cassette tapes that generated the highest volume of international sales were not the peaceful melodic showcases. The maximum financial return came from recordings where rival sound systems actively degraded and humiliated each other. Foreign audiences treated the legitimate desperation of the Kingston slums as an exotic spectator sport. The ownership class immediately pivoted their entire production model to service this lucrative demand for hostility. The concept of the sound clash was systematically mutated from a musical exhibition into a framework for audio warfare. Studio bosses stopped commissioning songs about unity and began demanding tracks explicitly designed to shatter the reputations of rivals. The production facilities were repurposed into acoustic armories, where vocalists manufactured targeted insults. This shift required a fundamental rewiring of the psychological environment within the studio compounds. The executives needed their human assets to operate in a state of constant, aggressive agitation. To achieve this, the producers implemented highly manipulative recording strategies. A studio boss would frequently bring an artist into the vocal booth and play them an unreleased track recorded by a competitor. These tracks usually contained highly personal, deeply offensive insults directed specifically at the listening artist. The executive would then demand an immediate, vitriolic vocal response on a fresh instrumental track. This tactic completely bypassed standard artistic processes, forcing the vocalist to react entirely out of localized survival instinct and bruised ego. Nitty Gritty found his specific vocal asset caught entirely within this new matrix of commercialized animosity. The executives realized that his distinct, high-pitched delivery sounded particularly menacing when delivering severe street-level threats. The contradiction of a delicate voice outlining precise methods of physical harm proved highly marketable in the international dancehall economy. His employers recognized they could generate massive profit margins by placing him in direct conflict with other high-value vocal assets. They began meticulously plotting a collision course between Nitty Gritty and a rapidly rising star known as Supercat. Supercat operated as another highly efficient piece of vocal machinery within the Kingston studio network. He possessed an aggressive, rapid-fire rhythmic delivery that contrasted sharply with Nitty Gritty's melodic wail. The industry operators understood that pitting these two distinct auditory signatures against each other would create a lucrative commercial friction. They did not view Nitty Gritty and Supercat as human beings navigating a dangerous urban landscape. They viewed them merely as opposing variables in a highly optimized profit equation. The executives initiated the conflict by actively spreading fabricated rumors between the two recording camps. They utilized studio engineers and session musicians as couriers to deliver inflammatory messages regarding professional disrespect. The localized nature of the Kingston music industry ensured that these engineered provocations circulated rapidly. The goal was to establish a baseline of genuine paranoia before either artist stepped in front of a microphone. The studio bosses were effectively investing in psychological distress to guarantee the authenticity of the final audio product. Once the tension reached an operational threshold, the producers ordered both artists to record exclusive dub plates targeting each other. Nitty Gritty was instructed to utilize his high-frequency vocals to systematically dismantle Supercat's street credibility. The financial directives from the ownership class were absolute. The insults had to be personal, cruel, and physically threatening. Any hesitation to record these severe threats resulted in the immediate withholding of essential daily recording stipends. The artists were forced to weaponize their voices against their peers simply to maintain their minimal financial lifelines. The resulting audio tracks represented a terrifying escalation in the commercialization of hatred. The recorded material bypassed standard artistic metaphors and detailed explicit scenarios of physical elimination. These tracks were rapidly pressed onto vinyl and shipped to the lucrative foreign markets in New York and London. The executives effectively outsourced the violent realities of the Kingston streets onto the international retail shelves. The cash flowed back to the fortified studio compounds, while the physical danger remained entirely concentrated on the artists. The commercial success of this specific rivalry generated unprecedented revenue for the distribution networks. Consumers eagerly purchased multiple records to follow the escalating audio hostility between Nitty Gritty and Supercat. The executives monitored these sales charts and immediately demanded further escalation from their vocal workforce. They required the artists to push the boundaries of their threats to maintain consumer engagement. The business model relied entirely on the continuous public deterioration of the artists' interpersonal relationships. This corporate strategy extracted a severe psychological toll on the performers trapped within the system. Nitty Gritty could no longer navigate his own neighborhood without the constant fear of physical retaliation. The threats he recorded in the isolated studio booths were now broadcasting loudly from speaker boxes on every street corner. The executives had successfully transformed his vocal asset into a tangible, physical liability. He was essentially broadcasting a continuous provocation to rival factions while lacking any personal security apparatus. The men who profited from this engineered hostility provided absolutely zero protection for their human assets. There were no corporate security details, no armored transportation, and no mediation protocols established by the record labels. When an artist left the fortified studio compound, they were entirely abandoned to the hostile environment they had just been forced to aggravate. The ownership class treated physical injury to an artist merely as an operational hazard that did not affect their primary royalty streams. The system was designed to absorb the loss of a vocalist without interrupting the flow of capital. As the months progressed, the psychological pressure of this unprotected existence began to fracture Nitty Gritty's operational capacity. He was forced to maintain a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning his environment for threats generated by his own audio output. The chemical coping mechanisms provided by the studio failed to suppress the acute reality of his situation. He recognized that the commercial friction engineered by his employers had irrevocably altered his physical safety parameters. The conflict was no longer confined to the magnetic tape. It was actively bleeding into his daily survival routine. The industry operators noticed this psychological strain, but viewed it solely as a marketing opportunity. They utilized the visible tension and paranoia of the artist to authenticate the violent narrative sold on the records. The genuine fear in Nitty Gritty's voice only increased the commercial value of his subsequent studio sessions. The system operated as a perfectly sealed vacuum of exploitation, feeding on the destruction of the very talent that powered it. The executives simply continued to tally the foreign export revenue, entirely detached from the street-level consequences of their directives. The climax of this specific operational phase arrived when the logistical boundaries of the industry began to shift. The massive profits generated by the Clash tapes allowed the Kingston power structures to establish physical outposts in foreign territories. Record stores in Brooklyn transitioned from mere retail outlets into crucial diplomatic and distribution hubs for the rival studio factions. The artists, seeking better financial margins, inevitably migrated toward these international centers of commerce. The geography of the conflict expanded, but the violent corporate mandates remained exactly the same. The displacement from Kingston to New York removed the final remaining localized social constraints, holding the violence in check. Nitty Gritty found himself operating in a foreign urban environment, still contractually bound to a persona of extreme aggression. The studio bosses in Jamaica continued to demand hostile audio content, indifferent to the shifting physical reality of their artists. The tension, engineered in the soundproof rooms of the Caribbean, was successfully exported to the concrete storefronts of the United States. The parameters for a catastrophic physical collision had been perfectly calibrated by the absentee ownership class. In August 1988, the operational reality of the dancehall industry experienced a catastrophic rupture. Another highly lucrative vocal asset named tenor saw was discovered lifeless on the side of a road in Houston, Texas. He possessed a similarly unique high-register vocal tone and shared a deep personal association with Nitty Gritty. Local law enforcement rapidly closed the file, officially categorizing the incident as a routine vehicular hit and run. However, the internal network of the Jamaican Music Syndicate immediately recognized the physical hallmarks of a targeted elimination. Tenor Saw had recently engaged in heavily promoted sound clashes prior to his sudden demise. The street-level distributors and sound system operators uniformly rejected the official police narrative. They understood that the extreme audio hostility mandated by the studio bosses had finally breached the physical perimeter. The violence was no longer contained within the grooves of pressed vinyl records. A primary revenue generator had been permanently removed from the international supply chain. This specific event completely shattered Nitty Gritty's remaining psychological defenses. He directly observed the ultimate consequence of the industry's manufactured aggression. The corporate mandate to trade violent threats for session fees had resulted in the physical destruction of his closest peer. His nervous system entered a state of permanent, extreme hypervigilance. The chemical coping mechanisms he relied upon now merely amplified his intense paralyzing paranoia. The conflict parameters immediately shifted from vocal warfare to physical armament. Nitty Gritty recognized that his studio-engineered enemies were actively operating within his geographical vicinity. He could no longer rely on his status as an international recording artist to provide any localized immunity. He procured physical hardware to defend himself against the threats he had been forced to broadcast. His daily routine transformed from a musical occupation into a highly stressful tactical survival operation. Every public appearance or studio visit now required rigorous route planning and continuous environmental scanning. He evaluated every passing vehicle and pedestrian for potential hostile intent. The localized networks of Jamaican expatriates in American cities function as rapid information conduits. Rumors of bounties and impending physical retaliation circulated constantly through the record shops and underground clubs. He navigated this hostile urban terrain entirely blind, without reliable intelligence or corporate backing. The executive class in Kingston received the news of Tenor Saw's elimination with cold, calculating detachment. They did not issue public condolences or halt their recording schedules out of respect. Their primary reaction involved auditing their archives to assess the value of his unreleased vocal tracks. The studio bosses recognized that a deceased artist generated a massive, immediate spike in back catalog sales. The physical destruction of a human asset was seamlessly converted into a highly profitable final quarter dividend. However, the producers also conducted a rapid risk assessment regarding their surviving highly agitated workforce. They realized that firearms and active street conflicts introduced unpredictable variables into their supply chain. Bullets firing inside a studio compound could damage highly expensive imported digital mixing consoles. The executives decided they would not absorb the collateral damage of the warfare they had deliberately engineered. They drafted an immediate, unwritten policy of total divestment from any artist exhibiting physical risk. The implementation of this divestment strategy was swift, silent, and financially devastating for Nitty Gritty. Studio owners abruptly stopped returning his phone calls and barred him from their fortified Kingston compounds. They immediately halted all cash advances and canceled his scheduled recording sessions. The daily stipends that kept him fed and housed vanished overnight without any formal notification. The system effectively deactivated his operational status while retaining complete ownership of his previous audio output. This abrupt financial starvation stranded Nitty Gritty in the foreign urban environment of New York. He required immediate capital to secure safe housing, transportation, and a physical security detail. Yet the distributor selling thousands of his records across the city refused to hand him a single dollar. They pointed to the exploitative contracts he had signed years earlier, claiming all revenue belonged to the Kingston producers. He was entirely surrounded by his own immense commercial success while lacking the funds to purchase a meal. Standard corporate structures utilize mediation protocols to de-escalate conflicts between high-value personnel. The Dancehall syndicate possessed absolutely zero infrastructure for dispute resolution or employee protection. The executives never arranged a sit-down between Nitty Gritty and his engineered rivals to negotiate a ceasefire. They viewed peace treaties as detrimental to the highly profitable Soundclash economy. The owners deliberately allowed the hostile friction to burn completely out of control on the streets. Nitty Gritty's isolation deepened as his financial and psychological resources rapidly evaporated. Former associates and session musicians distanced themselves, unwilling to stand near a designated target. The community of expatriate artists in Brooklyn recognized the lethal trajectory of his situation and stepped away. He was entirely abandoned by the social infrastructure that had previously supported his musical output. The corporate machine had extracted his vocal prime and left the hollowed-out remnants to face the ensuing consequences. Driven by extreme desperation, he attempted to confront the local distribution hubs directly. He visited the record stores, moving his vinyl, demanding a fraction of his own mechanical royalties. The storefront operators dismissed his claims, acting merely as independent retailers insulated from the production contracts. These interactions frequently escalated into highly visible, tense disputes inside the retail environments. His attempts to secure his stolen wages only further damaged his localized reputation, framing him as erratic and volatile. Simultaneously, the engineered hostility with Supercat continued to metastasize within this unprotected environment. Supercat was also navigating the high-stakes Jamaican diaspora in the United States. He was equally subjected to the constant street-level provocations generated by the imported clash tapes. Both men operated under extreme pressure, heavily armed, and entirely devoid of corporate mediation. The absentee ownership class had successfully placed two volatile elements into a confined geographical space. The consumer base actively participated in accelerating this localized tension. Dancehall audiences in Brooklyn discussed the impending collision with eager anticipation, treating it as a legitimate spectator sport. Underground promoters actively tried to book both artists in the same venues to capitalize on the hostile friction. The fans demanded a physical resolution to the audio conflict they had purchased on cassette tape. The public appetite for violence guaranteed that a peaceful de-escalation was logistically impossible. Nitty Gritty realized that the system had not merely abandoned him, it was actively waiting for his elimination. The distributors already had promotional strategies drafted for the inevitable spike in memorial record sales. His continued survival actually stalled the maximum potential yield of his existing catalog. The industry required a tragic conclusion to finalize the monetization of his specific narrative arc. He was functionally more valuable to the corporate ledger as a deceased legend than an active, demanding employee. The prolonged exposure to this extreme operational stress caused rapid, visible physical deterioration. The constant adrenaline of his hypervigilant state degraded his immune system and vocal capacity. The chemical dependencies originally used for studio endurance now served entirely to blunt the crushing reality of his abandonment. Witnesses from the era noted his erratic movements and the exhaustion permanently etched into his features. The vibrant, childlike asset that initially enriched the producers had been entirely consumed by the machinery. The Jamaican expatriate community in New York concentrated heavily around specific commercial corridors in Brooklyn. Flatbush Avenue and Church Avenue functioned as the primary arteries for the imported dancehall economy. These streets hosted a dense network of specialized record shops, underground clubs, and informal remittance centers. This concentration created a highly localized, inescapable ecosystem for the stranded artists. Avoiding rival factions meant completely cutting oneself off from the remaining scraps of the industry. The independent record stores served a dual purpose in this specific underground economy. They operated as retail fronts for the massive volume of vinyl shipped directly from Kingston pressing plants. Simultaneously, they functioned as informal diplomatic embassies for the various studio syndicates and their affiliated street factions. An artist entering a store to check their sales figures risked walking directly into enemy territory. These neutral commercial spaces were rapidly transforming into highly volatile flashpoints for physical confrontation. The New York Police Department possessed very little intelligence regarding the internal dynamics of the imported reggae syndicates. Law enforcement treated the escalating violence merely as routine, localized gang friction within an immigrant neighborhood. They did not recognize the complex transnational corporate mandates driving the hostilities on their streets. There were no specialized task forces assigned to monitor the executives orchestrating the violence from the Caribbean. The artists remained entirely invisible to the legal infrastructure of their host country. This systemic invisibility further emboldened the factions operating under the violent directives of the sound clash economy. Without the threat of targeted police intervention, the physical hunting of rival vocalists proceeded openly. Nitty Gritty's unique physical appearance and distinct vocal register made him instantly recognizable within the Brooklyn corridors. He could not blend into the background or disguise his presence from the network of informants. He was a highly visible, unprotected asset, navigating a zone of total impunity. The aggressive, violent persona he had been forced to adopt in the studio now felt like a heavy, suffocating constraint. The producers had explicitly programmed him to project absolute fearlessness and immediate physical retaliation. However, projecting this artificial dominance without the necessary financial or physical backing was a lethal strategic error. He was trapped inside a corporate-mandated character that actively provoked the very danger he was desperately trying to avoid. The psychological dissonance between his frightened reality and his marketed persona accelerated his internal collapse. The absolute refusal of the ownership class to intervene established a terrifying precedent for the entire music industry. By successfully washing their hands of Nitty Gritty's impending destruction, the executives perfected their model of disposable talent. They proved that a corporation could extract millions of dollars from an artist's physical output without assuming a single ounce of biological liability. The Kingston studios remained perfectly insulated, their digital mixing boards untouched by the impending gunfire. The cost of doing business was entirely transferred to the pavement of Brooklyn. By early 1991, his logistical perimeter in Brooklyn had shrunk to a critically dangerous circumference. He lacked the financial mobility to relocate to a secure territory or hire professional protection. The daily necessity of acquiring food and maintaining industry contacts forced him to navigate exposed public spaces. His movements became highly predictable to the rival factions, operating within the same localized diaspora. The system had effectively cornered him in a geographical trap of his own commercial making. The theoretical risk of the sound clash era had fully crystallized into a definitive physical countdown. The acoustic weapons he recorded in the soundproof booths of Kingston were completely useless on the concrete avenues of New York. Every avenue of corporate support, financial relief, or diplomatic mediation had been systematically severed by his employers. He walked the streets of Brooklyn fully aware that his engineered rivals were occupying the exact same retail spaces. A violent physical intersection was no longer a probability. It was a scheduled industrial outcome. The physical storefront of Superpower Records operated as the absolute epicenter of the Brooklyn dancehall economy. Located on a heavily congested stretch of Church Avenue, it served a function far beyond a simple retail outlet. The establishment acted as a critical intelligence hub and a primary distribution node for the Kingston studio syndicates. Racks of newly pressed Jamaican vinyl created narrow claustrophobic aisles that severely restricted physical mobility. It was an enclosed environment designed purely for high-volume commercial transactions, offering zero avenues for safe retreat during a crisis. Nitty Gritty frequented this specific location out of sheer unyielding economic desperation. He was actively attempting to intercept the revenue generated by his own voice before it was wired back to the Caribbean executives. He demanded face-to-face accounting from the local distributors who were moving massive units of his engineered clash tapes. These highly tense financial inquiries further alienated him from the local expatriate network operating the retail counters. He was essentially conducting an aggressive, one-man audit of a hostile, unregulated, and heavily armed supply chain. By late June of 1991, his physical condition reflected the immense strain of this prolonged financial starvation. The localized network of informants noted his increasingly erratic behavior and his permanent state of defensive readiness. He carried physical hardware at all times, recognizing that the corporate-mandated hostility could materialize at any given moment. His presence inside the record stores was no longer viewed as a promotional visit by an international artist. It was recognized by the local operators as a highly volatile liability waiting for an inevitable ignition source. The ownership class in Jamaica maintained their absolute silence and total divestment during these critical weeks. They continued to press and ship the hostile audio recordings featuring Nitty Gritty and Supercat to the Brooklyn storefronts. The executives possessed perfect visibility regarding the escalating street tension, but refused to issue any directives for a ceasefire. They treated the impending physical collision simply as a highly effective marketing campaign that required no further corporate expenditure. The absentee producers were content to let the physics of the street finalize their commercial narrative. June 24, 1991, arrived as a standard operational day within the Flatbush commercial corridor. Supercat, the rival asset engineered by the very same industry machinery, also operated within this tight geographical perimeter. He was navigating the identical pressures of the foreign market, similarly armed and equally subjected to the constant audio provocations. The lack of any corporate mediation protocols guaranteed that these two highly agitated elements would eventually occupy the same physical space. The structural design of the imported industry made a violent intersection a statistical certainty. During the afternoon hours, both artists converged on the confined premises of Superpower Records. There were no digital mixing consoles, soundproof booths, or studio engineers present to capture the interaction. The environment lacked the protective barrier of a recording microphone or the distance of a magnetic tape. The raw, unfiltered hostility meticulously cultivated by the absentee executives was finally unleashed in a tightly enclosed retail space. The engineered audio warfare instantly translated into immediate, inescapable physical proximity. Eyewitness accounts from the interior of the store detailed a rapid and catastrophic escalation of hostilities. The specific verbal exchange remained obscured by the chaos, but the underlying tension had been thoroughly documented on thousands of cassette tapes. The artificial, aggressive personas mandated by the Kingston producers completely overrode any localized survival instincts. Neither man possessed the tactical flexibility or the corporate permission to de-escalate the confrontation. The psychological programming installed by the studio bosses operated with flawless, devastating efficiency. The sound of 3 distinct ballistic discharges shattered the commercial atmosphere of the record shop. The acoustic weapons, manufactured in the Caribbean, had been replaced by the definitive reality of cold steel and gunpowder. Nitty Gritty sustained fatal physical trauma and collapsed onto the floor of the retail establishment. The unique high-register vocal asset that had generated millions of dollars for the global distribution network was permanently silenced. His biological existence ended at the age of 34, surrounded by the plastic merchandise that had dictated his demise. The immediate aftermath inside Superpower Records was defined by total operational shock. The theoretical violence sold to consumers worldwide had breached the threshold and stained the linoleum flooring. Supercat remained at the scene, instantly transitioning from an international recording artist to the primary subject of a fatal incident. The carefully constructed illusion of the dancehall clash was completely stripped away, revealing the lethal mechanics of the industry. The corporate machine had successfully orchestrated its climax, entirely off-site and entirely free of direct implication. The New York Police Department rapidly secured the perimeter along Church Avenue. Uniformed officers cordoned off the storefront, treating it as a standard urban crime scene rather than a transnational corporate casualty. Detectives processed the physical evidence, documenting the precise location of the deceased and the spent shell casings. They immediately took Supercat into official custody, initiating standard booking procedures for a major felony offense. The local law enforcement apparatus possessed zero context regarding the decade of financial exploitation that preceded the gunfire. The news of the fatal encounter traveled instantaneously back to the fortified studio compounds of Kingston. The executive response was not characterized by mourning, reflection, or operational reform. The producers immediately recognized that the violent elimination of Nitty Gritty represented an unprecedented commercial opportunity. They rapidly instructed their pressing plants to increase production on all of his existing back catalog. The physical destruction of their former employee guaranteed an immediate massive spike in consumer demand. Within the jurisdiction of New York, the legal machinery began processing the physical reality of the incident. The district attorney's office convened a grand jury to review the evidence and determine the validity of criminal indictments. This legal body operated under strict procedural guidelines, analyzing only the immediate sequence of events inside the record store. They evaluated the ballistics, the witness testimonies, and the physical positions of the two men involved. The grand jury's mandate did not include investigating the systemic psychological manipulation or the financial starvation that engineered the confrontation. Supercat's legal representation immediately constructed a robust defense strategy based entirely on self-preservation. They argued that their client operated under a reasonable, imminent fear for his own biological safety. Defense testimonies suggested that Nitty Gritty, driven by severe paranoia and extreme desperation, had initiated the physical threat. The defense framed the 3 discharged rounds not as premeditated elimination, but as a necessary, split-second survival mechanism. They effectively utilized the highly agitated state of the victim to justify the lethal force deployed by the survivor. The legal arguments presented behind closed doors perfectly mirrored the grim reality of the streets. Both men were heavily armed and highly paranoid because the industry had explicitly forced them into that posture. However, the courtroom only evaluated the final 10 seconds of a conflict that the executives had been building for 3 years. The law required a clear designation of an immediate aggressor and a victim. It had no legal framework to indict the absentee corporate architects who had locked both men inside a psychological cage. After reviewing the localized evidence, the grand jury returned a definitive legal conclusion. They officially dismissed the primary felony charges against Supercat, accepting the parameters of justifiable self-defense. The legal system formally decreed that the fatal response was legally permissible given the immediate circumstances inside the storefront. Supercat was released from custody, legally absolved of the ultimate responsibility for the elimination. The judicial process effectively closed the file on the physical incident without ever identifying the true source of the violence. This specific legal ruling represented the absolute triumph of the dancehall corporate structure. The executives in Kingston had successfully generated massive wealth from violent audio recordings, pushed their artists into a physical conflict, and suffered zero legal consequences. The grand jury's decision legally validated their model of utilizing disposable human assets. By focusing exclusively on the two men in the room, the justice system effectively shielded the men who built the room. The absentee ownership class retained their luxury assets and their freedom, completely insulated from the blood spilled in Brooklyn. The dismissal of charges also solidified the industry's absolute lack of financial liability toward the deceased. Because the incident was ruled justifiable, there were no avenues for Nitty Gritty's surviving family to pursue wrongful death compensation from the surviving artist. Furthermore, the studio bosses in Jamaica had never signed recognized employment contracts. There were no corporate insurance policies to claim, no severance packages, and absolutely no surviving trust funds. The financial ledger regarding Nitty Gritty was completely zeroed out the moment his heart stopped beating. The localized expatriate community absorbed the grand jury's decision with a heavy, cynical resignation. They understood that the American legal system was fundamentally incapable of deciphering the ruthless mechanics of the Jamaican music syndicate. The narrative of two armed immigrants settling a dispute in a record store neatly fit the existing biases of the local authorities. The underlying truth that a brilliant vocal talent was systematically ground down, starved, and marched into a fatal trap by predatory executives remained entirely ignored. The system required a convenient resolution, and the self-defense ruling provided the perfect administrative closure. The physical removal of Nitty Gritty did not halt commercial operations for a single hour. In fact, his abrupt elimination instantly transformed his existing catalog into highly profitable historical artifacts. Kingston producers recognized the massive spike in consumer demand. They immediately ordered their pressing facilities to rush his master tapes back to the manufacturing floor. Retail prices for his Clash tapes artificially inflated within days. While millions in posthumous revenue flowed back to fortified Caribbean studio accounts, Nitty Gritty's surviving family encountered a legal fortress. The original handwritten contract signed under extreme duress explicitly stripped his heirs of any intellectual property rights. They received zero financial compensation from the unprecedented global record sales. The system zeroed out his financial ledger the moment his heart stopped beating. To maintain the momentum of their expanding industry, the executives required a continuous influx of raw talent. Scouts returned to the impoverished urban sectors, seeking new adolescents with childlike vocal capabilities. The tragic fate of Nitty Gritty was not used as a cautionary tale, it was actively suppressed. The machine seamlessly ingested a new generation of vulnerable youth, using the exact same predatory paperwork. Today, Western audiences continue to embrace these cheerful, sun-drenched reggae rhythms. The clear audio quality perfectly masks the exhaustion, the chemical reliance, and the terrifying paranoia of the men trapped behind the microphones. The industry sold the world a beautiful illusion of global unity, funded entirely by the ruthless cannibalization of its creators.